In the dusty vaults of American history, certain photographs guard secrets that resist all explanation. Today, we're delving into one of the most unsettling images ever captured during the early 1900s, an ordinary-looking family portrait from 1906 that conceals a detail so disturbing it has haunted researchers and historians for more than 100 years. At first glance, it seems to show a tender moment between a mother and her child, but a closer look reveals something far more sinister. Before we go further, if you enjoy this kind of content, please hit the like button to support me. I'm also working on another channel filled with even more fascinating material. You can find the link in the description below. Let's unravel this chilling mystery together. The photograph first came to light in 2019 at an estate sale in Providence, Rhode Island. Margaret Chen, a collector of vintage photographs, was going through a box of uncatalogued images when she stumbled upon it, a formal portrait, the kind families would commission from photography studios in the early 1900s. The sepia-toned image showed a woman seated in an ornate wooden chair, her dark Victorian dress immaculate, her expression serene. Cradled in her arms was what looked like an infant wrapped in white christening clothes. Margaret nearly passed over it entirely. She had seen countless similar portraits, stiff poses, solemn faces, the formal staging typical of early photography, when exposures took several seconds and subjects had to remain completely still. But something made her take a second look. Something about the positioning of the mother's hands, something about the shadows in the folds of the infant's wrappings. She held the photograph up to the light streaming through the window of the estate sale house. The afternoon sun brought out details that had been hidden in the dim interior. Margaret's hand began to tremble. The photograph slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the hardwood floor. "Are you all right?" asked the estate coordinator, a young woman named Jessica, who had been cataloging items nearby. Margaret couldn't speak. She simply pointed at the photograph lying face up on the floor. Jessica picked it up, glanced at it, and then looked more closely. Her face went pale. "Oh my God," she whispered. "What is that?" The two women stood in silence, staring at the image. The mother in the photograph wasn't just holding a baby. Beside the infant, nestled in the crook of her other arm and partly hidden by the folds of the christening gown, was something else, something that shouldn't have been there. The more they looked, the less sense it made, and the more disturbing it became. On the back of the photograph, written in faded brown ink, was a simple notation: Mrs. Catherine Hartwell and children, Providence Studio, March 1906. Children, plural. Margaret bought the photograph for $5. She took it home to her apartment in downtown Providence, unable to shake the unease that had settled over her the moment she had seen it clearly. That evening, she scanned the image into her computer and zoomed in, examining every detail. The mother, Catherine Hartwell, appeared to be in her late 20s or early 30s. Her hair was styled in the fashion of the era, pulled back tightly from her face. Her eyes stared directly into the camera with an expression Margaret initially took for peacefulness. But the longer she looked, the more she questioned that interpretation. Was it peace in those eyes, or something else? Resignation? Denial? Or perhaps the carefully practiced blankness of someone determined not to reveal what they knew? The baby in her right arm was wrapped in typical christening clothes, layers of white cotton and lace, a small cap covering its head. Only the face was visible, and even that was partly shadowed. Margaret enhanced the image, adjusting contrast and brightness. The baby's face came into sharper focus, and she felt her stomach tighten. Something was wrong with the infant's expression. The eyes were too still. The skin had a strange quality to it, almost waxy in appearance. But it was the other object in Catherine's left arm that truly defied explanation, partially hidden beneath the white christening gown. Its outline was unmistakable once you saw it. And once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. If you're enjoying the video so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel, it really helps. Margaret spent that first night researching everything she could about Catherine Hartwell and Providence in 1906. The city had been flourishing during that time, a hub of industry and immigration. Families documented their lives through formal studio portraits, preserving moments for posterity. But what moment was this photograph meant to preserve? And why would any mother pose for such an image? The more Margaret dug, the more questions emerged. And the more she looked at that photograph, the more convinced she became that something deeply wrong had occurred in that Providence studio in March 1906, something that had been captured on film and hidden in plain sight for over a century. Margaret's research led her to the Providence Historical Society, where city records from the early 1900s were archived. She requested everything related to the Hartwell family. After 2 days of searching, an archivist named David brought her a thin folder containing census records, a marriage certificate, and several newspaper clippings. Catherine Hartwell, born Catherine Morrison in 1878, had married Thomas Hartwell in 1902. Thomas worked as a foreman at the Gorham Manufacturing Company, one of Providence's major employers. They lived in a modest home on Broad Street in a working-class neighborhood populated by factory workers and their families. The 1905 census listed Catherine, Thomas, and a daughter named Mary, born in 1903. No other children were recorded, but the photograph was dated March 1906, and the notation on the back mentioned children, plural. Margaret felt the familiar chill return as she read through the documents. The newspaper clippings told a darker story. In February 1906, just 1 month before the photograph was taken, a brief notice appeared in the Providence Journal: infant son of Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Hartwell passed away February 12 after brief illness. Services private. An infant son, unnamed in the notice, dead just 4 weeks before the photograph was taken. Margaret sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Was the baby in Catherine's arms in the photograph the dead infant? No, that couldn't be right. Photography studios in 1906 did sometimes photograph deceased family members as a way of preserving their memory. Post-mortem photography was common practice, but those images were clearly marked as memorial portraits. This one had been catalogued as a standard family portrait, unless. Margaret returned to the digital copy of the photograph on her laptop. She zoomed in on the infant's face again, examining it with new understanding: the waxy quality of the skin, the too still eyes, the peculiar stiffness of the small body. Could this be a post-mortem photograph that had been deliberately mislabeled or misunderstood? But that didn't explain the other object in Catherine's left arm. That didn't explain why the photograph felt so profoundly wrong. David the archivist appeared beside her table. "Finding what you need?" "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "Can you tell me anything about post-mortem photography practices in Providence during this period?" David nodded thoughtfully. It was common, actually, when a child died, especially an infant. Families would commission a photograph as their only visual memory, but they were usually clearly posed. The deceased would be arranged to look peaceful, often with flowers or religious items. Sometimes they'd be photographed with family members. "Why do you ask?" Margaret showed him the photograph on her computer screen. "Does this look like a post-mortem portrait to you?" David studied it for a long moment. His expression shifted from professional interest to something else: discomfort, perhaps, or recognition of something disturbing. "The baby could be," he said slowly. "The positioning, the lack of clear focus on the face, the stiffness." He leaned closer. "But what is that next to the baby?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." They both stared at the image. The object was roughly the same size as the infant, wrapped in similar white fabric, positioned in Catherine's left arm in a mirror image of how she held the baby in her right arm. But its shape was wrong. The proportions were distorted, and there was something about the way the fabric draped over it that suggested a form that was decidedly not infant-shaped. "Have you found any other records about the Hartwell family?" Margaret asked. David shook his head. "Nothing after 1906 in this folder. But I can check deeper archives if you want." "Please." Over the next 3 days, David searched while Margaret continued to analyze the photograph. She contacted historical photography experts, showing them the image and asking for their interpretation. The responses were unanimous: this was highly unusual. The composition, the dual objects in the mother's arms, the ambiguous nature of what was being photographed, none of it fit standard practices of the era. One expert, Dr. Sarah Chen from Brown University, agreed to meet with Margaret in person. She brought specialized equipment to examine the original photograph, which Margaret had carefully preserved in an acid-free sleeve. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Chen murmured, examining the image under magnification. "The photographer clearly wanted both objects to be visible, but there's an attempt at concealment, too. See how the fabric is arranged? It's almost as if what?" Dr. Chen looked up, her expression troubled. "As if the mother wanted to document something, but couldn't be explicit about it. As if this photograph was meant to hide a truth in plain sight. Leave a comment below about what you think of this story so far." Margaret's next lead came from an unexpected source. While posting about the photograph in an online forum dedicated to historical mysteries, she received a private message from a user named Rhodes Archive. The message contained a single line: "Check the Providence studio registry, March 1906. The photographer recorded something strange that day." Margaret immediately contacted David at the Historical Society. "Do you have registries from photography studios?" "Some," David replied. "Which studio?" "Providence Studio, March 1906. It took David another day to locate the records. Providence Studio had been a prominent establishment on Westminster Street, owned and operated by a man named Albert Fletcher. Fletcher had been meticulous in his record-keeping, and his ledgers had survived intact. The entry for March 14, 1906, read, "Mrs. Catherine Hartwell, family portrait, special circumstances. Payment $12, triple standard rate. Note, session conducted after hours. Private." Mrs. Hartwell, most insistent on specific arrangement, refused multiple attempts to repose subjects. Exposure successful despite unusual nature of sitting. Negative retained per customer request for potential future prints. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. Triple the standard rate. After hours. Special circumstances. What had Catherine Hartwell been so desperate to document that she'd paid 3 times the normal price and insisted on a private session? But it was the final line that caught her attention: negative retained per customer request for potential future prints. "David, do you have any idea where photographers' negatives from this era might be stored? If they survived, they'd be in private collections or possibly with the Providence Preservation Society." Fletcher's studio closed in 1923, and the inventory was auctioned off, but glass negatives were fragile. Most were probably destroyed or lost. Margaret spent the next week tracking down leads. She contacted antique dealers, historical preservation societies, and private collectors. Finally, she found a retired photographer named Robert Mills, who specialized in collecting early photographic equipment and materials. He had purchased a box of glass negatives at an estate sale 15 years earlier, never bothering to examine them closely. "You're welcome to look through them," he told Margaret when she called. "But I can't promise anything." His storage unit in Cranston was filled with photographic equipment from various eras. The box of negatives sat on a metal shelf covered in dust. Margaret carefully lifted out each glass plate, holding them up to the light from the open door. She found it on the 23rd plate, the negative image of Catherine Hartwell and the 2 wrapped objects in her arms. But negatives revealed details that weren't always visible in the positive prints. Margaret asked Robert if he could develop a fresh print from the negative. "Sure, but it'll take me a few days to set up the darkroom. Haven't developed glass plate negatives in years." When Robert called her back 5 days later, his voice sounded shaken. "You need to come see this." The fresh print from the original negative revealed details that had been lost or degraded in the copy Margaret had found. The resolution was sharper, the contrast stronger, and what it showed made Margaret's blood run cold. The object in Catherine's left arm was now clearly visible. It was roughly the size and shape of an infant wrapped in christening clothes. But where a baby's face should have been, there was something else. The fabric was arranged to partially conceal it, but the outline was unmistakable. It wasn't a face at all. It was something that had been shaped and positioned to mimic an infant's form, but the proportions were wrong, the structure impossible. And Catherine's face, now visible in higher resolution, showed an expression that Margaret had initially misread as peaceful. It wasn't peace. It was the blank, traumatized stare of someone who had witnessed something that shattered their understanding of the world. Her eyes weren't looking at the camera. They were looking through it, into some middle distance where nothing made sense anymore. Robert stood beside Margaret, both of them staring at the fresh print. "What is that?" he whispered. "What is she holding?" Margaret had no answer, but she had a new lead. On the back of the glass negative, scratched in Albert Fletcher's handwriting, was a note that hadn't been visible on the paper copy: "May God have mercy on this family. I should not have taken this photograph, but she begged me. And what was I to do? She said it was the only way to show the truth." If you're enjoying this mystery so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps. Margaret knew she needed to find out what happened to the Hartwell family after March 1906. David at the Historical Society had expanded his search, combing through city records, hospital admissions, police reports, and newspaper archives. What he found painted a disturbing picture. In April 1906, just 1 month after the photograph was taken, Catherine Hartwell was admitted to Butler Hospital, Providence's psychiatric institution. The admission record, written in cramped handwriting, stated, "Patient exhibits severe melancholia and delusional thinking. Claims to have witnessed impossible event. Husband reports patient has been inconsolable since death of infant son in February. Patient insists on caring for both children despite repeated explanations that only daughter remains living. Catherine remained at Butler Hospital for 3 years. Medical notes from her stay revealed a woman trapped in grief and trauma, unable to accept the death of her infant son. But some entries hinted at something more complex. One doctor noted, patient maintains consistent story despite isolation and treatment. Details remain unchanged across multiple interviews. Patient shows no other signs of delusion or mental instability. She seems aware of how her claims sound, yet cannot recount them. What claims? What story did Catherine tell repeatedly during her 3 years of institutionalization? Margaret filed a request for Catherine's full medical records, but Butler Hospital informed her that records from that era had been destroyed in a fire in 1954. All that remained were the fragmentary admission notes that had been copied into the city health department's records. Thomas Hartwell, Catherine's husband, remarried in 1909 while Catherine was still institutionalized. He moved to Boston with his new wife and daughter, Mary. Catherine was released from Butler Hospital in 1909 and disappeared from public records. No death certificate, no census entries, no further documentation. She simply vanished from the historical record as if she had never existed. But Margaret found one more clue. In a box of personal letters donated to the Historical Society by a descendant of Albert Fletcher, the photographer, she discovered a letter dated May 1906, "Dear brother, I am leaving Providence. I cannot continue my work here after what I photographed in March. You will think me mad, but I must tell someone. Mrs. Hartwell came to my studio with 2 bundles. One was her infant son, deceased. She wished to have a memorial portrait, which I would have done gladly, though my heart broke for her. But the other bundle, God help me, I cannot write it. She insisted that I photograph them together. She said people needed to see what had happened. She said her infant son had not died of illness as reported. She said he had been replaced. She said what she was holding in her left arm was what had been left in her baby's crib the night he supposedly died. I thought her mad with grief, but when I uncovered the bundle to arrange it properly for the photograph, I cannot write what I saw. I exposed the plate as she requested, I took her money, and then I locked my studio and did not sleep for 3 nights. I see it still when I close my eyes. I am a man of science and reason, but there are things reason cannot explain. Whatever was in that bundle was not of natural origin. Mrs. Hartwell was not mad. She was trying to document evidence of something that should not exist. I am leaving Providence and will never speak of this again. Your brother, Albert. The letter ended there. Margaret found records showing that Albert Fletcher moved to Portland, Maine in June 1906 and opened a new photography studio. He never returned to Providence. He died in 1934, and his obituary made no mention of his Providence years. Margaret sat in the Historical Society reading room, surrounded by documents and printouts, the fresh photograph from the original negative lying on the table before her. She had assembled the facts. An infant boy died in February 1906, 1 month later, his mother had a private photograph taken, insisting on a specific arrangement. She held what appeared to be 2 infants, though only one daughter was documented as living. The photographer was so disturbed by what he saw that he left the city. The mother spent 3 years in a psychiatric hospital, maintaining a consistent story. No one would say explicitly what the story was or what the second object in the photograph actually showed. Margaret zoomed in again on the high-resolution scan of the fresh print. The object in Catherine's left arm was wrapped in the same christening clothes as the infant in her right arm, but the shape underneath the fabric was wrong in ways that Margaret couldn't articulate. It seemed to shift depending on how long she looked at it. Sometimes it appeared to have a face, small, rounded, infant-like. But then the shapes would resolve differently, and she'd see something else entirely, something that made no biological sense. Dr. Chen from Brown University examined the new print and provided her analysis. This is either an elaborate hoax, which seems unlikely given the photographer's reaction and subsequent behavior, or it's documentation of something that the people involved genuinely believed was real and impossible. Catherine Hartwell either experienced a severe psychological break after her infant's death, or she witnessed something that we cannot explain with our current understanding of reality. Which do you believe? Margaret asked. Dr. Chen stared at the photograph for a long moment. I'm a scientist. I should say it was a psychological break. She pointed at the object in Catherine's left arm. But I've been studying historical photographs for 20 years. I've never seen anything like this. The way it's shaped, the way the fabric drapes over it, the proportions, it's as if someone tried to create something that looked like an infant but didn't quite understand the correct form. Or as if something tried to mimic an infant's shape but couldn't quite manage it. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. You think it's real? You think Catherine was holding something that shouldn't exist? I think Catherine believed she was holding something that shouldn't exist. I think the photographer believed it, too. I think something happened in Providence in early 1906 that was so disturbing, so impossible, that the only people who could document it were silenced or dismissed as mad. Dr. Chen paused. But what actually happened? The truth, I don't think we'll ever know. Margaret published her findings in a paper titled, The Hartwell Photograph, a study in early 20th century trauma documentation or evidence of the unexplained. The academic community was divided. Some viewed it as an interesting case study in post-mortem photography and grief-induced delusion. Others found the evidence compelling enough to warrant further investigation. The paper sparked heated debates in historical and paranormal research circles. Margaret received hundreds of emails, some from skeptics demanding she admit to fabrication, others from believers thanking her for bringing attention to what they saw as undeniable proof of the supernatural. But most emails came from ordinary people who had simply seen the photograph and couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong with it. One email stood out. It came from a woman named Eleanor Pritchard, who identified herself as a distant cousin of Catherine Hartwell. Eleanor was 83 years old, living in a nursing home in Vermont, and she claimed to have information that had been passed down through her family for generations. Margaret drove to Vermont the following week. The nursing home was a pleasant facility overlooking Lake Champlain, and Eleanor was waiting for her in a sunny common room, a worn leather journal resting on her lap. My grandmother told me about Catherine when I was a girl, Eleanor began, her voice soft but steady. The family never spoke of her openly. There was too much shame attached to mental illness back then. But my grandmother felt sorry for Catherine. She believed her. Believed what, exactly? Margaret asked. Eleanor opened the journal. Inside were handwritten letters, pressed flowers, and several small photographs. Catherine didn't die or disappear after leaving Butler Hospital. She came to live with my grandmother in Vermont. Changed her name to Catherine Morrison, went back to her maiden name. She lived quietly, worked as a seamstress, never married again. She died in 1947 at the age of 69. Margaret felt her heart racing. Did she ever talk about what happened, about the photograph? Not at first. But in her final years, when she was dying of cancer, she told my grandmother everything. My grandmother wrote it all down. Eleanor turned the pages carefully, revealing neat handwriting dated 1946. Would you like to hear it? Margaret nodded, unable to speak. Eleanor began to read. Catherine told me that in February 1906, her infant son James became ill. He developed a high fever and was restless, crying constantly. On the third night of his illness, Catherine sat by his crib, watching over him. Around 3 in the morning, she dozed off in her chair. She woke to complete silence. The baby had stopped crying. Catherine approached the crib, relieved that perhaps the fever had broken and he was sleeping peacefully. But when she looked into the crib, she knew immediately that something was wrong. The baby looked like James, same size, same dark hair, same features, but a mother knows her child. This infant's eyes were wrong. The color was right, but they moved differently, tracked differently, and when it made sounds, they weren't quite right either. Close, but not exact, like someone trying to imitate a baby's cry without fully understanding it. Catherine lifted the infant from the crib. It was cold, not fever hot like James had been, and the weight was wrong, distributed strangely in her arms. She called for Thomas, but he saw nothing unusual. To him, it was just their son, recovered from his fever. But Catherine knew. She knew this wasn't James. She searched the house frantically that night, looking for her real son, and in the cellar she found something wrapped in a blanket in the corner. It was small and still and wrong, but it had been shaped to look like an infant. When she uncovered it, she saw. Eleanor paused, her hands trembling slightly. My grandmother couldn't write what Catherine saw. She just wrote, something that tried to look human but failed. Margaret leaned forward. What did Catherine do? She brought it upstairs. She showed it to Thomas, tried to make him see that their real son was gone and something had been left in his place. But Thomas refused to look closely. He told her she was hysterical, that the fever had broken and James was fine. He took the bundle from her and burned it in the fireplace before she could stop him. The next day, he called the doctor. The baby, the replacement, was examined and declared healthy. No one would listen to Catherine. No one would look closely enough to see what she saw. So she went to the photographer. She begged him to photograph both the living child and what she believed was some kind of evidence of what had happened. She'd retrieved pieces of the burned bundle from the fireplace and wrapped them back up. The photographer initially refused, but Catherine paid him triple his rate. She told him she needed proof, that she needed someone else to see what she was seeing. When he unwrapped the bundle to position it properly, he saw what she'd been trying to tell everyone. My grandmother wrote, the photographer confirmed to Catherine that what she'd collected from the fireplace was not organic matter as would be expected. It appeared to be some kind of constructed form assembled from materials he couldn't identify, designed to mimic but not perfectly replicate infant anatomy. After that sitting, Catherine's life fell apart. Thomas had her committed. The photograph was locked away, and the child that everyone believed was James grew up as Mary's brother, though Catherine knew it wasn't her son. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the mystery, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps. Margaret sat in stunned silence. What happened to the child? The one everyone thought was James? Eleanor turned more pages. He died in 1911 at age 5. Sudden illness, very similar to what James had experienced in 1906. Thomas and his new wife had him buried quickly, private service. According to Catherine, Thomas finally looked closely at the body before burial and saw what she'd been trying to tell him for 5 years. He never spoke to or acknowledged Catherine again after that. The guilt destroyed him. He died in 1918, and my grandmother believed it was partly from the weight of knowing his wife had been right all along. And Mary, the daughter, lived until 1976, refused to discuss her childhood. But she told her own daughter once that she remembered having a little brother who wasn't quite right, who never seemed to understand how to play or interact normally, who would sometimes just stare at people with an expression that made her uncomfortable. She was relieved when he died, though she felt guilty about that relief her entire life. Margaret returned to Providence with copies of Eleanor's grandmother's journal. The detailed account provided context for the photograph, but it didn't resolve the fundamental mystery: what exactly had Catherine Hartwell been holding that day in March 1906? She consulted with experts in various fields. A folklorist pointed out similarities to changeling legends, stories found in cultures worldwide about supernatural beings who replace human children. But those were myths, fairy tales, cautionary stories, weren't they? An anthropologist noted that nearly every culture has some version of these stories, suggesting either universal psychological phenomena related to infant illness and death, or, more disturbingly, the possibility that these stories originated from actual unexplained occurrences that people could only interpret through a supernatural framework. A pediatric psychiatrist explained that mothers experiencing severe postpartum psychosis or grief-induced delusion sometimes develop the conviction that their child has been replaced. It's a known phenomenon called Capgras delusion, she explained. The person recognizes familiar features but is convinced the loved one is an imposter. It can be very specific and very persistent. But the photographer had seen it too, had confirmed Catherine's observations. That was what kept Margaret from accepting the psychological explanation entirely. 2 people independently had reacted with horror to what they saw. Margaret reached out to descendants of Albert Fletcher, the photographer. His grandson, now in his 80s, remembered family stories about the incident in Providence that had driven his grandfather to leave the city. My father told me that grandfather would sometimes wake from nightmares, shouting about something he'd photographed that shouldn't exist, the grandson told Margaret over the phone. He never explained what it was, but he kept a note locked in his desk. After he died, my father found it. It just said, "I photographed something that proved we don't understand the nature of reality." I wish I hadn't. In 2023, Margaret arranged for multiple scientific analyses of the photograph. A forensic imaging specialist used advanced technology to examine every pixel, looking for signs of manipulation, double exposure, or digital alteration. The results were inconclusive. If the photograph had been manipulated, it was done with such extraordinary skill that it left no detectable evidence using current technology. But the specialist noted something odd that had escaped previous notice. "Look at the light reflections," she told Margaret, pointing at the computer screen. "The infant in the right arm reflects light normally. You can see the natural play of highlights and shadows on the fabric, consistent with the studio lighting Fletcher would have used. But the object in the left arm, the light interacts with it differently. It's subtle, but the reflections are wrong. It's as if the material has different optical properties than cotton fabric should have." A materials scientist examined high-resolution scans and agreed, whatever that object is wrapped in, it's either not cotton, or it's cotton that's been treated with something that changes how light reflects off it. In 1906, there weren't many chemical treatments available that would create this effect. It's anomalous. A reconstruction artist attempted to model what shape would be required to create the specific wrapping pattern visible in the photograph. After multiple attempts, she told Margaret, "I can't make it work. The way the fabric drapes suggests a form underneath, but when I try to create a 3-dimensional model that would produce those exact folds and shadows, the shape I get doesn't correspond to anything that could physically exist. It's like trying to draw an Escher staircase, it looks right in 2 dimensions, but it can't actually exist in 3-dimensional space." These scientific findings only deepened the mystery. Either the photograph documented something genuinely anomalous, or it was an incredibly sophisticated hoax created with technology and knowledge that shouldn't have been available in 1906. Margaret interviewed descendants of the Hartwell family, finally locating Thomas's great-granddaughter in Seattle. The woman, now in her 70s, had heard family stories about the first wife who went mad, but nothing specific. Her grandmother, Thomas and Catherine's daughter, Mary, had refused to speak about her mother or the events of 1906. All she would say was, "Some things shouldn't be remembered. Some things should stay buried." But the great-granddaughter shared one chilling detail: "My grandmother had a recurring nightmare her entire adult life. She'd dream about a baby in a crib. And in the dream, she'd know she needed to check on it, but she'd be terrified to look. When she finally forced herself to look in the dream, the baby would turn its head toward her, and she'd see that it wasn't a baby at all, but something wearing a baby's face like a mask. She'd wake up screaming. She had this nightmare from childhood until the week she died." The photograph itself became something of a phenomenon online after Margaret's paper was published. Paranormal enthusiasts claimed it as evidence of supernatural replacement or changeling mythology. Skeptics argued it was either a misunderstood post-mortem photograph or an elaborate period hoax. Neither side could definitively prove their case, and the debate grew increasingly heated. But something else happened that Margaret hadn't anticipated. People began reporting strange experiences after viewing the photograph for extended periods. Dozens of emails described similar phenomena: a sense of unease that persisted hours after looking at the image, dreams featuring wrapped bundles or wrong-looking babies, a feeling of being watched while near the photograph. Margaret initially dismissed these reports as psychological suggestion. People primed to expect something creepy naturally experienced creepy feelings. But then she noticed a pattern. People who reported these experiences often mentioned specific details they couldn't have known: the smell of old roses, Catherine's favorite perfume, according to Eleanor's grandmother's journal, the sound of a music box playing. Thomas had given Catherine a music box that played lullabies, now in the Historical Society's collection, or the feeling of extreme cold. The cellar where Catherine found the first bundle was notorious for being inexplicably frigid, even in summer. A sleep researcher who examined the photograph for Margaret developed severe insomnia and requested that the image be removed from his lab. "I'm a scientist," he told her. "I don't believe in curses or haunted objects. But every time I close my eyes, I see that photograph, and I see things in it that I didn't notice while I was looking at it directly. Shapes moving under the fabric, the mother's expression changing. I can't explain it, and I don't want to study it anymore." Margaret herself experienced the phenomenon. After spending months with the photograph, studying it daily, she began having vivid dreams set in Providence in 1906. In the dreams, she was in Albert Fletcher's studio, watching Catherine Hartwell unwrap the bundle in her left arm. But just before the contents were revealed, she'd wake up, her heart pounding, absolutely convinced that she'd been about to see something that would fundamentally change her understanding of reality. The photograph remains in Margaret's possession, stored in a climate-controlled archive in a locked room. She occasionally receives requests to examine it from researchers, historians, and paranormal investigators. Each person who studies it comes away with more questions than answers, and several have reported the same disturbing dreams and persistent sense of unease. Margaret has developed her own theory, though she admits it's based more on intuition than evidence. She believes Catherine's infant son did die in February 1906, but that something else appeared afterward, something that looked enough like the baby to fool most observers, but that his mother would recognize as wrong. Catherine, desperate to make someone see what she was seeing, commissioned the photograph as proof. The photographer, confronted with something his rational mind couldn't process, fled rather than acknowledge what he'd seen. But what was it? People always ask Margaret. What was in Catherine's arms? Margaret has learned to answer honestly, "I don't know." Maybe it was a grief-induced delusion shared by two traumatized people. Maybe it was evidence of something we don't have the framework to understand. Maybe the truth is somewhere between those explanations. What I know is that something happened in Providence in March 1906 that was significant enough to destroy multiple lives and create a documented mystery that persists 119 years later. The photograph hangs in Margaret's study now, behind glass, a silent witness to something that may or may not have happened over a century ago. Sometimes when she's working late and catches sight of it in her peripheral vision, she swears the wrapped object in Catherine's left arm has moved slightly, changed position. But when she looks directly at it, everything is as it always was, a sepia-toned image of a woman holding two bundles, her face frozen in an expression of unspeakable knowledge, her secret preserved forever in the chemicals and silver of early photography. Margaret has stopped trying to solve the mystery definitively. Instead, she's focused on preserving the documentation, Catherine's story, Albert's letter, the medical records, the scientific analyses, so that future researchers with better technology or different perspectives might find answers. She's created a digital archive backed up in multiple locations, ensuring that the evidence survives even if the original photograph eventually degrades. Recently, she received a letter from a quantum physicist who'd heard about the photograph. He proposed a theory that consciousness might be able to perceive or interact with reality in ways we don't fully understand, and that extreme stress or grief might heighten these abilities. What if Catherine Hartwell and Albert Fletcher were able to perceive something that existed in a state we can't normally observe, he wrote. What if the photograph captured not just visible light, but something else, some other aspect of reality that we don't have instruments to measure? It's an intriguing theory. But like all theories about the Hartwell photograph, it remains speculation. The truth, if there is a truth, stays locked in that frozen moment from 1906. The mystery of what Catherine Hartwell was holding in March 1906 remains unsolved. Perhaps it will never be solved. Perhaps some truths are meant to remain hidden, visible only to those who experience them, preserved in photographs that raise more questions than they answer. What was in Catherine's arms that day? Was it simply the tragic delusion of a grieving mother? Or was it evidence of something that shouldn't exist? Was it a carefully constructed hoax, or documentation of an event that falls outside our current understanding of what's possible? The photograph cannot tell us. It can only show us what was there, leaving interpretation to viewers separated by time and understanding. And perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps the mystery itself is the point, a reminder that despite all our scientific advances and rational thinking, there are still corners of human experience that resist explanation. The image remains, a mother, two bundles, and a truth that may be too terrible or too impossible to ever fully comprehend. Catherine Hartwell stares out from that moment in 1906, her eyes holding knowledge that she tried desperately to share, wrapped in layers of fabric and time that may never be fully unwrapped. And somewhere in some dusty archive or forgotten attic, there may be other photographs like this one, other frozen moments that captured something impossible, waiting to be discovered, and to remind us that reality might be stranger and more complex than we dare to imagine. If you enjoyed this video, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your opinion and answer your questions. If you're not subscribed yet, take this opportunity to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos.